Welcome back to season 4 of A Couple of Multiples, the reality of dissociative identity disorder. Did you know that according to a recent Harvard study, 93% of people living with DID are initially misdiagnosed by mental health professionals? That's a staggering statistic, and it's exactly why we're here.
This season, we're diving deep into clinical interventions, what actually helps when it comes to recognizing and treating dissociative disorders. Whether you're a mental health provider, a supporter, or someone navigating life with multiplicity, this season is for you.
Thank you for being here, and please share this episode with a friend, your therapist, psychiatrist, or colleague. Together, we can help improve access to accurate diagnoses and effective compassionate care.
And most importantly, remember that every system is different. What works for one may not work for another, and that's okay. Your journey is valid, your healing is real, and we're so glad you're hanging out with
A Couple of Multiples.
This episode is sponsored by the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, ICM, soon to be the Creative Mindfulness Network, is the only EMDR therapy training program founded by an openly plural clinician, EMDR therapy author, Dr. Jamie Plus Marich.
We felt so seen and validated when we were able to authentically participate in this training as Garden System. And although grounded in the EMDR International Association for Curriculum Standards, ICM elevates the values of lived experience and the expressive arts in their training programs.
They actively work with shattering the stigma around dissociative responses. Please visit www.instituteforcreativemindfulness.com to learn more. Today's episode is sponsored by Petals of a Rose, a short film about a day in the life of a woman living with dissociative identity disorder.
Petals of a Rose has received international acclaim for being an accurate and respectful depiction of DID. The most common response from DID systems being, "I've never felt so seen."
The film has subtitles available in 13 languages, and audio descriptions are included for the visually impaired.
Petals of a Rose is available to watch for free at www.dylancrumpler.com/watch-petals-of-a-rose.
Welcome to Season 4 of A Couple of Multiples, the reality of dissociative identity disorder. We are your hosts, Drew
and Garden System. Season 4 is going to be all about the clinical interventions and treatments for people living with dissociative identity disorder. And what better way to kick it off than to start with how to recognize dissociation, how to assess for it, and differentiate between the various dissociative disorders.
Today, we have invited Dorinna Ruh, licensed clinical social worker, to come share important information for all mental health professionals about dissociative disorders. Dorinna's career has spanned 34 years as she became a counselor in 1989, working in the substance abuse field. She obtained her master's degree in social work from the State University of New York in 1995. After moving to Fort Collins, Colorado in 1999, she started a private practice. She was trained in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, in 2001 and found that this therapy was so powerful and such a good fit for her that it has been her primary lens since then. By 2010, she was both certified in and an approved consultant in EMDR therapy. For the past 9 years, she has facilitated EMDR trainings for HAP trauma recovery and is currently a trainer candidate. She specializes in working with complex trauma and dissociative disorders, and in addition to her therapy practice, she offers consultation and training for other therapists through her consultation business, Advanced EMDR Education.
Welcome, Dorinna. We are so glad to have you here today. So, we both have recently watched your free training on assessing dissociation, and we really enjoyed it. It contained such important, up-to-date information about dissociation and dissociative disorders, and we immediately thought we need to have her on the podcast. So, we are so grateful that you said yes when we reached out to you.
Well, I was thrilled to be asked. So thank you for reaching out.
Thank you. You're welcome. All right. So, are we ready to get started?
We're so ready.
All right. So, in your words, what is dissociation?
Okay. So I'm going to start with a little story because it happened yesterday. So yesterday was my day to go swimming. I didn't really want to go because I never really want to go. In fact, today I literally said I would love swimming if it didn't involve being wet. So anyway, I didn't realize how autopilot I was. But I got myself to the gym. And all of a sudden I'm swimming, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, you're here. Like you got this far. And it was like this little like, ooh. And it wasn't that I wasn't present for the whole thing.
Right.
I was in like some kind of like autopilot because it was something I didn't really want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say yesterday, I probably had a little bit of a, semi-dissociated where I was kind of going through the motions, getting myself ready in the pool. And it wasn't until I had done a couple of laps that I suddenly was like, oh, I'm swimming.
Absolutely.
So I'm sharing this because I just want to normalize dissociation it happens. It happens to all of us, and it happens all the time. So, when I'm doing something unpleasant like that, I got into autopilot. And so autopilot is somewhat of a dissociative process. Highway hypnosis, right? You're driving along, you're so absorbed in gosh knows what, that suddenly you're past your exit, right?
Yep.
Tying our shoes is actually a dissociative act. So dissociation in and of itself is something we all do. And I think it can be a wonderful coping tool at times too. When we're standing for a long time, our feet hurt, right? When we have to go to the pool and we don't want to, you name it. And I think that it's important to know that people dissociate on average about 4 to 5% of the time. It's a
lot.
It's a normal, absolutely normal thing. I think that for how I look at it is that if we're children, it usually starts in childhood where we have no recourse. There's no way to escape the situation we're in. It can happen as adults, and it does, but a lot of what we see is children are in situations that are horrible that they cannot escape. Children know on some level that I can't like go out, get a job, get an apartment. I'm 9 years old and my parents are horrible. I think I'll go leave. No, you can't. So what do? You have to find a way to survive. And I think they find a way to not really be present in their environment as a way to survive. I called it a superpower before I heard Jamie Marich call it a superpower. And I remember listening to an interview and I was like, I've been calling this a superpower. So I think truly it's a brilliant way to survive. So that would be my explanation of what dissociation is. I don't know if you want me to. I think there's more questions, and I think we can talk more.
We'll get to it. Yeah.
A brilliant way to survive. I love that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It actually reminds me, right? So like I have this memory of the first time like I intentionally or quote was learning to dissociate that I can remember, and I probably was 4 or 5 years old. And so like my parents were a Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night church going family, right? And like for a 4-year-old, who cares? Like, but I can remember like, oh, if I do this thing that I didn't have a name for, like it'll be over. Like we'll skip the whole sermon. Like I don't have to actually listen to it. And that's kind of like looking back, I'm like, I taught myself to dissociate to escape the boredom of church.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Would you please just describe the dissociative continuum?
Okay. So I think I stole my version of this from Joanne Twombly. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but I studied with her for years, and a lot of what I do I learned from her. She's a book out. She published a book last year. So I think this might be her dissociative continuum that I just want to give her credit. I didn't make this.
Absolutely. Cool.
But if you could look at it like it's a spectrum, and on the left side we've got, and I hate to use the word normal, so I'm not really sure what to call it, but just everyday average dissociation that everybody does 4 to 5% of the time. And then the next level of dissociation would be something like peak performance. Athletes do it, soldiers. I remember over 20 years ago having a man who was an ex-soldier, and he's like, they taught me how to check out.
Mhm.
And so there are
Wow.
going to be times like that, or you're deep involved in the zone, right? That's
Right, in the
another level.
zone.
And so as we keep moving up, then we've got maybe more simple PTSD, and you'll see people sometimes dissociate only when they're thinking about the memory,
Right.
or only if someone brings up the memory, right? And it might just be like a little bit of a not quite present. And as we move through, the dissociation becomes more prevalent until we get through like more complex trauma. You're going to see more dissociation. And then we move into like, well, they used to call it DIDNOS, just dissociative
Yeah.
disorder. And I just loved that. It made so much sense. But now it's like UDD and UC. I don't even know. But we get into that. And then the last side, or the last piece of the spectrum all the way on the end, would be DID.
Mhm.
And I think one of the ways that I consider it is that, and there's a picture I have where it shows like the parts, being kind of blurred, or gray circles around them. And we kind of blur back and forth. And as we get more into a dissociative disorder, parts have done such a good job keeping the trauma material kind of locked away that we just don't get as much of that kind of blurring back and forth. And the parts that keep the trauma really try to keep the trauma. And I think when they get triggered, they get very, very present. And so that would be the kind of the spectrum. So yeah, I don't know if you want me to expand on that.
Well, I'm thinking like I really like how I think it's the ICD labels OSDD, or what you were saying, the UDD. They call it partial DID now, which I think is a better term for it. And I'm thinking, like, yeah, like when you get to DID, like you are blocking the trauma. Like that's I think that's a big sign too, is like, I have absolutely no childhood trauma. My childhood was perfect and happy and da da da. Like that's like a huge red flag right there. That's what I kept spouting everywhere. Oh yeah, I'm depressed and I'm self-harming and I'm this and I'm that, but I don't have any trauma. Like, really?
And that is exactly one of the warning signs. If people present with a lot of maladaptive behaviors, and they say my childhood was great, that's a clue. The one thing that is a little bit of a soapbox for me, I have a lot of them, but is I think people get too hung up on trying to differentiate, is it DID or not?
Right.
Because my opinion is, if it's, I didn't know it was called partial DID, but once you get to a point where your dissociation is so protective and the parts are so like really like going to keep it under lock and key, I don't know that it matters if so much. Like as a clinician, I'm going to treat everybody the same. I'm going to want to get to know the parts. I'm going to want to make it safe for them to do the work, right? But I see people getting really hung up on that DID piece, and it really frustrates me personally.
And I will share a little piece. When I took a training to get my complex trauma certificate, which I decided not to renew, I took the training with Janina Fisher, and when she got to the part talking about DID, she kept describing it like, oh, like DID is very, very rare. And, like, it's like if somebody gets in their car and drives off to another state because they've forgotten everything. And I was like, that doesn't sound, that sounds like the old dissociative fugue diagnosis, not DID.
I totally agree with, I agree with you. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where people get a little, again, it becomes I think there's some misconception. My understanding really is that when you start having really true amnesia, that's when you start to have the diagnosis. So I have clients who have DID, and they're not like a different person coming in every week, but they still have a system that has different parts that are functioning to live life, and they have amnesia. And it may not be I fly to Seattle. It might just be like, oh, I just drove to my next town, or but yeah. So I had another thought, and 6%. That's what I was going to say. So the new research says 6% of the outpatient mental health population has DID.
That is a really important figure. Can you just repeat that again for our listeners?
6%, some of the more recent research, 6% of the like outpatient mental health community has DID. And I just think, again, we look at like the whole broad world, and we're at like what, 1%, and I heard someone actually say the other day to me, like, what do you see more, horses or zebras? So, and I'm like, but that's a terrible way to look at it, because there are, it's not that rare. It's just not that rare. And I think people are starting to get it. I think the younger generation of therapists are getting trained better.
Absolutely. I think
I
there's a
just
lot more recognition. We have a lot more people coming to our community now, reaching out to us who are like, I didn't know until I realized, like it took them a while to figure it out. And they're like, I have a lot, or they come to me, they figured out they have one, and they're like, if I start thinking about my other clients, like, yes, I can start seeing those signs again, And so like you kind of already answered this, but maybe we could just expand on this whole concept here. So I think it's important that, people understand what does 6% really mean, right? So like how likely is it that a clinician will have a client that meets the criteria for a dissociative disorder? I mean, I'm thinking about like when we were back in grad school, right? Or like a lot of people back in grad school were told you'll never see a case of it.
Right. Right. So another research study that I found said it could be as high as 29% of our clients have dissociative disorders. And then again, that we're starting to look at sort of like the higher level of the spectrum, but that's way higher than what we were told. And so we're starting to look at it being as common as mood disorders.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm thinking of therapists I've talked to and people I've encountered. They're EMDR therapists, or they say they treat complex trauma, but then they say, but I've never had a DID client.
That's right. And they've not had any suicidal clients either.
Well, that's not true.
That's a joke. Have you ever? I have people. I don't work with suicidal clients. I'm like, well, you're just not asking.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, we just don't tell you, like, I know for us, like, if you don't ask the right question, like, we're not giving you the answer. Like,
Exactly.
it's not meant to be like obstinate or resistant. It's just like, we're not really going to think to tell you that.
That's exactly true. So, yeah.
Okay.
I did want to point out, I didn't get a chance to say it, but when you were talking about the continuum and you were talking about DID, that parts or cells are protective and how protective they are. I love how you use that protective word because I think that is a very good clue. I love that. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, so what are some signs that a client is dissociating?
All right. So this is the fun part, is sometimes there aren't any obvious signs. And that's part of the misconception I think people have, is that they're going to catch it. They're going to see it. They're going to know it. And Garden System, you made a really good point. People don't come in and say, I dissociate.
Right.
They're not going to volunteer it. Some of them don't even know. They think they're forgetful. So you might hear like, my family gets so mad at me because I'm forgetting things. Oh, okay. But you definitely are going to, if you're paying attention, you can sometimes see some signs. So someone's eyes might change. I have a couple of folks who have had tells. My friend has noticed, like, she has one person who just kind of starts rubbing her arm when she starts to dissociate. I have another client and her eyes would go a little bit back and forth. There may just be a difference. And you have to ask, really. Yeah. But some of the tells might be you get sleepy. You might be starting to feel energy shifts as a therapist, or you get, kind of spacey yourself. You're looking for a tell, and it might just be they're withdrawn and quiet. And sometimes I have to check with folks because they're thinking, and I can't tell if they're thinking or if they're still with me, right? If they're still present. So I will ask them.
Yep.
And so honestly, I think the best way to find out if someone dissociates, I mean, there's a lot of good ways to assess it, I think, that don't involve screening tools. But the best way to do it is just to ask.
Yeah.
Hey, I noticed your face changed a little bit. Where are you still with me? You just ask.
Yeah, you can use those reflective skills, about what you're seeing. Like, I'll say things like, your voice got really high there as you were answering that question, or I've said, you seem really childlike in this moment, and like bringing their awareness up as well.
Yep. Yes.
I'm thinking of a client, like her teenage part comes and we know because she starts twirling her hair. And like, that's her tell. I mean, they're really subtle signs, and so we're kind of answering my next question here. And so I think this is really important to really emphasize, how easy is it for clinicians to miss when a client is dissociating and for what reasons?
So I think one problem with that is the numbers we've been told and the way there's a denial about dissociation in our field. I've heard stories about like the director of a community mental health clinic doesn't believe in DID. And so if you're getting that from the top down, it makes it really hard to get trained appropriately and to get the education that you need as a therapist. So I think, again, I think there's some shifting, but it's a slow go. And people still can't seem to wrap their head around it. I do a lot of consultation, and I find that even people who I have gone over this with, like ad infinitum, I'll still find that they're kind of either missing it or minimizing the impact on doing the trauma work, and they'll move too quickly forward. But I also think it isn't obvious. And so there is that free movie. Hopefully we can put a link, and we're going to cover a lot of it. But if anyone's curious to hear the movie that you were referring to, Garden System, the Assessing Dissociation, it is free on my website.
Yes, we can put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, sure, one of the things we came up with was this idea of like a puzzle. And there's 9 different big puzzle pieces that you're starting to put together and collect that help you, sort of inform your assessment if someone has a dissociative disorder or not. And seeing it in your office is only one piece of it. And I think people think they have to see it in their office, where there's a lot of clues day one. I truly think day one, we could figure quite a bit if we know what to look for. And that's the key, right?
Yeah, absolutely knowing what to look for. And I think we're going to get into some of that. I'm thinking, I was watching a dissociation training, and I might not say her name right, Dr. Thema Bryant. And she said that one of the things that she looks for is gaps in the stories. So clients would be telling a story, but there's like pieces that are missing. And I remember having a client talking to me about a disagreement with their significant other, and I had them like backtrack and put things in order, and then I was like, and then what happened next? And she was like, I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I could think of another one like points of view change, or there's like opinion differences. Like one day the client says one thing and the next day it's something different.
Yeah, those opposites there. We could
but again,
stories,
if we don't think as the clinician that dissociative disorders really exist or are a thing, then we're not even it's not even gonna cross our mind. Right. So if someone gets super tired and withdrawn, we're like, oh, they're tired today, or not tired, but quiet and withdrawn. Yeah, we're not even going to think about it. And that's the piece that I think needs to come out, is that just you need to be asking and paying attention to this, because it's there. And if you want your folks to get better, you really need to catch it. You need to be able to help understand it, and you need to help them you understand it, they understand it, and then you can work with it. And people can heal. But if you're not treating the right thing, this is true for the medical field, right? If I go in with gallstones and they take out my appendix, I'm still going to have a problem. So I need someone who can accurately diagnose me and then do the right treatment based on that. So
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. That leads perfectly into your question.
It sure does. How does catching dissociation help a client get better? And what does get better really mean?
So when you say catching it, I took that in a number. Either we catch it in the office or the client starts catching it out in the world. And I think either way, what it can do is, one of the things I didn't say, I think dissociative disorders are really it's a problem of discernment. And I can explain that a little more if you want, but I think that the dissociation isn't the problem. It's getting the messages that we have to dissociate all the time, even when we're not in danger today. It's that whole idea of being caught in the past and trauma time and all of that. And so if we can help a client to catch that they're starting to dissociate, and some people start to fade a little before, every person's different. They can pause, take a breath, ground, right? Where am I? And the hope for me is that a lot of my folks can start to be more discerning of, am I okay? Do I need to do this? Can we, who knows if I'm safe or not? And that's another piece of this, is can we get the system to start to work with the pieces of everybody work together, so you don't have one little part who's like, oh my God, we're in danger. Because things are different now. And I do a lot of orienting to time and place, because that's so powerful for folks when they realize, like, what, you're 40, your perpetrator is dead. There's so much you can do. So to me, it's about discernment. So if you can teach people how to understand it, how to embrace it as like, of course I do this. Let's figure out how I can do it more with more discernment so that I'm using it when I need it. Because my joke with my clients, it's not a joke, is that if I'm in a car accident and my foot gets cut off, I want to dissociate.
Exactly.
Like it is really, really, I imagine when I adopted my child, so I actually didn't have to go through childbirth, but my gosh, I would love to, if I had to, really like to dissociate, So there definitely are situations where it's incredibly appropriate, and again, childhood abuse, absolutely. Hunger. I mean, it's not just being harmed by another person. It can be hunger. It can be being teased and having to go into that lunchroom, regardless of the fact that you're just going to get food thrown at you. How do you endure that without going crazy or killing yourself? You check out, and it's truly, it's brilliant.
It's a brilliant adaptation.
I believe so, right? The problem becomes when you're 50 and you walk into a school cafeteria and you smell that smell and suddenly you're gone. So if we can catch every part up and we can help with that, it's not going to happen 100% of the time, but the more people start to realize that they can be present and that things are safe today, I think the parts actually will relax some. And they don't have to do such extreme things because they start to realize they're not in an extreme circumstance.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the question my therapist asks, some of our younger selves, and that is, how do you know it was over? Like, how did you know it was done?
Yes.
That's a good question.
And they still haven't answered that, but we'll get there.
Yep.
So, all right. So the next question we have is, are most clients destabilized that meet the criteria for a dissociative disorder? And kind of in the same ballpark is, how do most clients show up for therapy when there is an underlying dissociative disorder?
Okay. So the answer to the first one is no, they're not always destabilized at all. I've had PhDs who have gone, I mean, people are incredibly, incredibly successful. That is not a measure of a dissociative disorder.
Yeah, I think that was just really important to make that clear. Like,
you could have our listeners to know that,
and I think it's important for our listeners and people living with DID to know that, like, people show up and have a dissociative disorder, and they do have a PhD. They are leading highly functional, successful lives. Not everybody that with DID is, in a crisis.
Exactly. That's very true. So the second part was, repeat the second part.
Yeah, sure. How do most clients show up for therapy when there is an underlying dissociative disorder?
Well, and again, if they don't know it, which and even that's starting to change. I mean, there's been just a lot more education. I mean, I don't know if you watched Moon Knight, but there is a Marvel superhero who has DID. We watched it. My kiddo must have been 10, and he comes to me one day. Now he's maybe a little older, and he's, Mom, I have DID. I have a really angry part of me. And I thought, okay, you do have a really angry part of you. But I think people come in because they're not sleeping, or they're finding that they're anxious all the time, or there's a depression, or their relationships are being impacted, right? Or they know, some people just come in and they say, I know I had a lot of trauma in my childhood. I want to heal it. But they don't necessarily come in and say, I have a dissociative disorder, or I dissociate too much, or, that's generally my experience. I do think it's changing some.
Yeah, with more knowledge out there, people recognize themselves in some of the things they see on social media.
Yes. I think one of the problems that I find very frustrating in the fact that the community doesn't understand, and I'm sure you're familiar with the ISSTD research study from 2011, where the average length of time someone's in therapy, if they have a dissociative disorder, is 7 to 12 years in therapy. And then I've witnessed that as a therapist, where I've seen people work with a therapist 5 years prior to seeing me. And people who are approved consultants, they're like X-level IFS trained, I mean, all kinds of things, approved consultants in EMDR. And the person comes after 5 years to me for whatever reason. Sometimes it's just like their therapist is leaving. It's not even like I haven't made progress. And I'm like, hey, has anyone ever talked to you about dissociation? Nope.
No.
Nope. And the amount of difference and progress someone can make when they have the right treatment really is compelling. And so I think I guess my point is, if you've been in therapy your whole life and no one's ever talked to you about this, it's even going to be harder for you to know.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking, like it takes so long to get a diagnosis, it gets missed so easily. And there's, I guess, Harvard's recent study says that psychiatrists misdiagnose it like, what, 93% of the time is what I was reading recently.
Is that the number? I believe it.
Yeah.
And my theory
So,
is because there's no pill for it, right? So it's
right.
much easier to diagnose bipolar disorder and put somebody in mood stabilizer. And you know what? Their mood will stabilize. And so then
Right.
it just confirms that they have bipolar disorder, but they don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what happened to me. They diagnosed me with bipolar and put me on lithium. That
Yeah.
was not
Yep.
fun.
And I'm thinking about, because like we show up complaining about our mood, or we complain that there's mood swings, but really it's just switching, and, I'm like, I showed up because of depression and suicidal ideation, and I did therapy on that for like years and years, and went from one therapist to another, and, and nothing ever changed. Nothing ever got better until I learned about dissociation. Then I got a recommendation for somebody, and then that's when it finally really got assessed and then actually diagnosed.
Yeah.
Long time. So,
Well, and to be honest, I was one of those people. I'm just sitting here realizing, like, you have a soapbox, but I was one of those people. I started my training in the substance abuse field in the 90s, and the belief was no trauma work in the first year, which makes me want to like explode my head. Like, there's no recovery in the first year if you don't, they kind of work together. But so I had no trauma training when I got my EMDR training, and now I'm an EMDR therapist. And I missed one of my biggest misses, and thank goodness it turned out well, is she scored a 2 on this DES, which everyone gives for an EMDR world, and she scored a 2. And her history, if I had day one, I would have gotten her in my office, I would have known immediately that she had a dissociative disorder. Like, that's her history, all the signs, everything. But I was ignorant, didn't know, and it took me 7 to 8 years to figure it out. And I'm just so glad she lived because there were some scary times in all of that.
Yeah.
And then I was able to figure it out. And at that point, I think I was starting to get more consultation, and she's doing fantastic.
That's wonderful to hear.
But I was one of those people. And that's the other piece, is I don't want anybody to be me making those mistakes, because I'm lucky.
Yeah, I think it's so valid for other clinicians to hear this, right? Because sometimes we do get a little harsh about, you need to recognize it, and all these things, right? But like, it's not really like it wasn't taught in grad school, right? There isn't a whole lot of training on, and even with a lot of the trauma training, they don't include dissociation training. So like, no wonder there are therapists that don't know what they're looking for. They miss it, and that's why we're doing this, right? Because we want people to be aware. So it's not that anybody was, quote, bad for missing it before, right? We know what we know, and then when we know better, we do better. And so that's where we're at, is learning to do better at this point,
Well, when did Richard Clough start doing his work? It was the 80s. I mean, that was not that long ago. I mean, I think that's the other piece of this. This is a relatively new field in a way. It's been around forever, but it's a relatively new.
There's a lot of interesting history about, the course of DID. It used to be, I think, lumped under schizophrenia for a while as well. Like, that's where they had it, and then of course, and we'll get into this in probably a future podcast episode, but like the false memory thing was going around too. And then that shut everything down. So yeah, like we're really in a place of like, if you didn't know, or you don't know, or you're just learning about this, like you're not alone, and that's okay. Like, here we are, we're here to educate and help more people.
Many people to know as possible.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is
well, and think about how many vets who train in the United States to work in the United States know how to treat zebras, right? And so I guess that's part of it too. If it's a zebra versus a horse, but I guess it's the idea that we're realizing, wait, there's a lot more zebras than when we realized. That's really the key. It's not that, it's that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's getting to the point where the prevalence rate is so high that it needs to be more common training than specialized training.
Ooh, that was very well said. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I know we've already asked what are some signs that a client's dissociating, but what are some clues that a client may have a dissociative disorder?
So I'm going to refer to the 9 puzzle pieces. I'm sure it's, an incomplete list, but the idea is that, well, first of all, you're never done assessing. So dissociation is not a yes, no, or dissociative disorder is not a yes, no. It's it's something that people can discover. Like it'll start becoming I don't want to call it a block, or becomes an issue clinically that kind of steps in as protection. It can happen way into even trauma work. And so this idea that it's like, yes, no, which is what I used to do before I knew better. Yes, no, you're always assessing. And you might find that it doesn't come out until the worst trauma memory in EMDR, 2 years into work, or it might be day one, but knowing what to look for. So the 9 categories that we came up with, and again, I'm sure it's going to be an evolving list, is there are some things clients are going to tell you day one that are signs of a dissociative disorder. For example, if they've been in lots of therapy and they haven't gotten better, bing, that's a clue. They have had multiple diagnoses in their lives. Ding, it's a clue. Does it mean they have it? No, but you're pulling it all together to try to fill in this puzzle. They don't remember their childhood. Or, like you mentioned, garden system, they're coming in with like every symptom under the sun, and yet they had a wonderful childhood. That's another clue. There are lots of hospitalizations have happened. Maybe they have pain syndromes or other kinds of unexplained medical stuff simultaneous with their emotional. So those kinds of things, parents who tell me about your parent. Oh, my mom was crazy, or my mom, whatever, was in and out of the hospital. That's another clue. So you start to compile this, and I think the scale starts to tip, and you're like, oh, okay, that's some really good information. Day one. That's day one for most therapists. Right? You're going to ask these questions. Mm-hmm. And so that's a big piece. And we do have a sheet. I compiled a big, huge list. Medical trauma is another one, right? Refugees. Like there are just certain situations that lead towards more dissociation to survive. Right? Exactly. So that's one. You can use something like the DES, which I think is a great screening tool, way to get the conversation going. But it's not a be-all, end-all. Like I said, my DID person, who she was ultimately diagnosed with DID, she scored a 2. Mm-hmm. And eventually she was like, yeah, the part that came in and looked good. Her part looks really good. Yeah. She looked really good. And there I was, cheerleader, and then 2 days later, the suicide attempt. That was what flagged me finally to kind of like, whoa, something's not adding up. So the mid, I think, is more robust. I like the mid, but I think people rely on this too much. Like, I think you could have 9 puzzle pieces or 8 filled in that are like tipping towards dissociative disorder, and the mid just won't matter. Right. Because I know is already there. Right? If it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck. And once you start talking to your clients about it, like they'll know. You just got to be willing to have the conversation. But some of the other things, you are going to watch your client. You are going to pay attention to the client signs. Are they forgetful? Do they don't remember what happened in between or last session, things like that. How do we feel in session? Like I said earlier, there's the high-risk populations, medical trauma, gender dysphoria, refugee population. You want to pay attention to that. Medical trauma as a kid, kids are not treated well in the medical establishment. They're just not. I've witnessed it. And so I think it was really bad when I was a kid. I think it's still tough. There's not a lot of pain stuff they give babies. So what do? Right? You survive. So I do think we're looking at all of this and we're constantly paying attention. Yes. And then the one thing I'm going to give credit for my colleague, Maggie Robbins, who is on the video with me, her comment was, especially with EMDR, we do a lot of interventions, right? There's those of you who are EMDR therapists listening, you do phase 2, which is stabilization and safety. You're doing a lot of interventions. Your interventions are a part of your assessment. Mm-hmm. And right there, it tells you, how are we doing, right? And so everything you do is part of your assessment. You're constantly assessing.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And so the other form, actually, I can that's available with our movie is Maggie put together a chart of here's the signs in each of the phases of EMDR that show that your client might have dissociation. And that's really helpful for people who need to be really concrete.
So that is a really important form to have. So is that on your website?
It's on, if you go into the movie, the handouts are included.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
I think I lost the thought I had.
Oh, I was going to say, I think this is really important stuff because I think people with DID are often very good at masking. Mm-hmm. And they don't know they're doing that, but that's what they're doing. And to make it seem like everything's okay, because that's kind of the point. You don't want people to know,
right.
that
Well, aren't you also convincing yourself that everything's okay?
Yes.
I mean, you really have to sort of convince yourself. Otherwise, again, I don't think you have a whole lot of other choices.
True.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know. All right. So let's see here. What level of awareness do these clients have for their own dissociation or their system of selves when they first come to therapy? Like in your experience?
I think it varies. I think with overall, not much. But I have had people come in and say, I think I might have DID. And then one person came in, she said, I've been drawing little pictures of my different selves. And she had had some things disappear and she was started to be suspicious about herself. And so some people kind of have that awareness, or the one that I shared, who we missed, I missed it for 8 years. When I finally said, hey, I think this is what's going on, she was like, really? And she started doing research and everything fit. And she felt so relieved because she had no idea why people were calling her different names in public. Right.
Wow. Yeah.
And they were. And so for her, and she was a very smart woman and she really ran with it, which was lovely. So I think overall, you're going to have the mix where some people, when you start talking about dissociation, they're like, oh my gosh, that explains everything. And they're so relieved. It's like, oh, there are some people who will fight you tooth and nail. And, they'll go and take one of these tests and they'll say 000 because they went and did research and they found out that it's multiple personality disorder. And then they don't understand. And so you're going to find, I think, a whole mix, but most of the time people do not know, I would say, as my experience is they come in with a trauma history. They have symptoms and they want to be better. They want to feel better.
Exactly. I'm thinking of a client that I have, and like session number 1, intake session, right? And so coming in for trauma, doing the DES and doing a little bit of explanation, about the dissociative spectrum of things, and like the first response she said was, please don't tell me I have multiple personalities. And I was like, oh, there we go. There's the sign,
Exactly.
It's a flag up
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
I would say overall, most people don't know. I don't want to, make it a big broad thing, but
yeah, I think it's important that clinicians and even people living with DID or who are wondering if they do, like, you don't necessarily have an awareness of all the selves, and you're not, it doesn't really occur to you at first, and there's a lot of like awareness that you have to kind of build into, noticing when you're switching and realizing what's happening, and not all selves have 100% amnesia from each other. There's a lot of blending and co-consciousness that can happen as
That's
well. And having that awareness can just feel a little weird, honestly.
Absolutely.
I guess one thing I would want to add, and this is what I said earlier, it's like when you're an EMDR therapist and you want to do, the whole goal is trauma work. I do think it's important that you understand, like, it's not just the DID that's going to cause blocks for successful trauma processing. It's any kind of dissociative protection. So I think it's really important. And that's a message I really try to give people, is that if someone's dissociating as a coping tool to deal with their trauma, you really want to be careful and you want to honor that. Like, you can't and I'll say this to my clients sometimes. I'll say, you know what? I bet you have parts that hate me. I'm one more do-good social worker showing up who's going to help. You know what? They should hate me. Like, or they should at least not trust me. Right?
Yeah.
I want them to keep an eye on me and make sure I'm trustworthy, because how many people have jumped in and say, we're going to do trauma work? No, that's like the most scary thing of all. Or people think they're supposed to talk about their trauma. No, you don't actually start there.
Right.
And there's such a misconception. And so I think, I forget, I kind of lost my train of thought, but this idea that, it's only DID that we have to be careful for. No, you have to be honoring dissociation because it's there. And it's there for a super good reason. So let's figure out why, and then let's work with it instead of trying to bulldoze through it, because guess what? That is not going to go well. And I can promise you, well, I can't promise you. Best case scenario is that the client will dissociate. Right. Worst case, and I think this might be one of the questions, worst case scenario, I've had parts act out so scary that I'm lucky the person lived. Like, you just have to appreciate that when that kind of protective system is in place, it can be incredibly, I don't know what the word is, not persistent, but it is, it's a force to be reckoned with.
Yes.
For good reason. Right. And so that's where I think we have to stay so curious and work with a person and their system. Yeah.
And you can work around these things and get to a point where you can reach into those things, but it does take carefulness basically as you're working with it. I'm thinking of a client, not a DID client, but like we would do EMDR and then she's like, there's a block. And it would be like, yeah, there's a block. It's there for a reason. So she's like, well, I don't want it to be there. And I'm like, okay, well, let's go with that. You don't want the block to be there. And so like she'd have all these like visualizations of trying to like tear the block down and all of this. And I was like, you know what, let's just walk away from the block and go someplace else. And then she was like, no, we can't walk away from it. Like the wall followed us apparently or something like that, And I'm like, okay, well, let's just sit with it then. And then when we did that, that's when it came down.
Yep. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool stories.
Okay. Yeah. And I think another piece, which I might be getting ahead of myself, but I think it's not just that we don't want to jump too quickly into trauma work. I think that the preparation phase needs its own special care or intentionality. And each person's going to be a little different. But how do we make it so that there's enough adaptive memory networks to be accessed? And I think there's some super creative ways that we could go about that. But first, again, the first step is you have to know it's happening.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
And then there are amazing ways to work with folks. Amazing. So.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. In your assessing dissociation training, you talk about the back of the head scale. Would you please explain that for our listeners and how it could be helpful?
I will. And so the back of the head scale is something that was created by Jim Knipe, who is just a fantastic EMDR. I would say legend almost, but he lives half an hour from here, and he's the most delightful man in the world. And so he has he works with he has a book actually called the EMDR Toolbox that works with dissociation and EMDR, and he's the one who created this. And so I have gotten feedback from a couple of clinicians who have DID or are diagnosed with DID who really dislike this. So I just want to have that caveat that I use it all the time. My clients don't seem to have a problem with it, but it may not be for everyone. And I just want to be clear.
And that's okay.
Everything's not for everyone, but
right.
Our suggestion really is that you introduce, so the back of the head scale basically is this idea that you would say to your client, oh, and I guess I can show, imagine there's a line that goes from the back of your head all the way to say about 18 inches in front of your face. So there's an imaginary line that goes from the back of your head to 18 inches in front of your face. And if you're 18 inches in front of your face, you're fully present. Like right now, we hope that I'm fully present. I'm sure I'm having moments of like, slipping back a little bit into nervousness or something, but like my hands are cold and I can feel my feet on the floor, that kind of thing. I am here with you. And as we move back, we get less and less present and more not present. And so I'll even say, here I'm thinking about dinner. I'm not quite here. I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner. But we can go all the way back to the back of our head where we're completely not here. And we also could be so in a memory as if we're re-experiencing it. Or we might be on the ceiling watching, but we're not here anymore. We might. So there's the whole spectrum. And I think if we can teach that early on, and it's not just me and my colleague Maggie, if we can teach this early on to folks and normalize it, like, hey, a lot of people dissociate as a way to cope with tough childhoods. That's all you have to say. Yeah. Dissociation is a way to just not really quite be present. And it's not a bad thing, but I want to know about it because it really will interfere with our ability to do EMDR. And you can just say it that way, right? Start out there. I'm going to teach you this thing called the back of the head scale. This way, I might check with you here and there if I notice something and just check and see where you are, because it's a really good way to check in on yourself. And so, we can even model that, like how many times do we dissociate or lose our train of thought or we're just suddenly, I'm thinking about lunch. Like I'm literally in session thinking about lunch. We need to come back and we can easily say, oh my gosh, sorry. I was gone for a minute, right? We can model that. So I think if we teach it at the beginning in whatever way, whether we use the back of the head scale or not, I think then when you do have someone dissociating in your office, you don't have to pause and then give the discussion. You know what I'm saying? Like if you set it up, normalize it at the beginning and say, let's just keep an eye on how you've learned to use this superpower, right? If you normalize it day one, you have a little way to communicate about it. Then 6 sessions in, when the person's eyes are darting back and forth or, something's up, you can say, hey, time out. Let's check in. I'll say, just for the heck of it, where are you on that back of the head scale?
Yeah, sometimes
And
just asking randomly and you don't even realize it. And they're like, oh, I'm only 50% here. And you're like,
yes, I'm
oh.
here, right? And the other thing that I like about the back of the head scale is when we are dissociated or in a trauma memory, our Broca's center goes offline, which means we don't have speech,
Mhm.
right? So if we just have somebody point, I think it just makes it easier. So I have found it to be useful. My colleague has found it to be useful, but I have gotten some feedback that consistently two people were just like, yeah, no, we hate that. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, and you can find other ways to measure this. You know, like
You really can.
my therapist taught us to like just hold our hand out and then like
Oh,
slowly bring it back. And the further back we are, the more
perfect.
dissociated, the
Hmm.
further our hand is out,
Yep.
the more present we are. You know, and I love that like doing this in the beginning and normalizing it so that like there's not this shame associated with being dissociated and that it's okay to admit that I'm not here is really
Exactly.
important.
Right. Otherwise, you have to say, hey, I think you dissociated. And they're like, what's that? And we're like, well, and then it becomes a thing. Whereas if I just don't think it is if you talk about it early. But yeah, that arm you could use in group and even just, you know,
Yes.
whether it's however you use it. But I think my thought is that we're educating a bunch of people who really don't necessarily know how to do this. And so if they can have one little tool that they can try, you know, it's something. It's some kind of language that they can start to work with. And yeah, you're right. You can totally modify it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I love it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. So once we know that a client is dissociated or they're not fully present, so how can a therapist help a client that is dissociated become more present?
So I think some of the just typical grounding things that people are taught, I think they are really good, right? Look around my room, count the paintings on the wall, or find something that starts with the letter S. Color could be good. A lot of people use something called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's a big one, right? 5 things I can see, 4 things I can, or 5 things I can hear. I in another book I can make a plug for is Coping with Trauma Related Dissociation, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's a workbook,
Yep.
and in there they do something called 3, 2, 1. And what they do is the client would work, and I've actually played around with it, which is why I decided I liked it better. If you ask the client to describe or order 3 things they see, but they have to describe each one with 3 words, you have to be a lot more present. Because what I realized is I could sit here and say to you, yep, I see a fan, I see a picture, I see a clock, I see a computer screen, I see a chair. I can do that and sort of be half present.
Right,
But
exactly.
if I had to say to you, I see a fan, it's white, there are white lights coming out of it, and it's moving slowly, and there's a silver chain coming down, I have to be a little more present. So I have adapted. I don't use 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in that. I do this instead. And I think it gets people a little more present, encourage them to do that on their own. There's something called anchors in that book where people, I have clients in my office who they come up with anchors, like things that they like in my office that are pleasant or soothing or positive, and they'll go around and find the anchors. I have a big office. One of them touches the texture on this big painting I have that, you know, so something that helps folks become, you know, kind of like instead of being so in, helps to pull them out so they can start to be familiar with their surroundings again. I think playing catch is great. But the one thing I'll say is to use, so I kind of share a funny story because I think
absolutely, yes.
So I was teaching this somewhere, I don't even know, and I was teaching playing catch. Jim Knipe that's one of his big ways to help people get back is you play catch. It's really hard to dissociate and play catch.
This is true.
So she said, "Oh, that's an awful suggestion. That's an awful technique." She says, "One time I threw a tissue box at somebody and it hit them," and I was like, "You're not supposed to throw a tissue box." He suggests like take a tissue and roll it up because it has a lot. It's really hard to catch.
Really?
And I was just like, "No, not the tissue box. No."
Nothing that'll do damage.
Yeah. So like I have some soft balls, you know, that they're squishy and we throw those, or a tissue works in a pinch. But yeah, no, don't throw things that are harmful. Yeah. Like a rock, you know.
No, yeah. My therapist has what do you call it? Hacky sack ball that
Perfect.
we do, you know, and then for my own office, I used some yarn and created like my own koosh ball made out of yarn.
Had her make one for me too.
I know, it was fun. And so
You
like
seen
that's
those monster ones? The big
Yes.
monster? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, those are really
Awesome.
cool.
Fun to
You know?
play with.
I did have one client who she would freeze and dissociate. And in order to end our sessions, she would tell me, this was years ago, she would tell me what happened on Jersey Shore. And so I had never actually watched Jersey Shore, but I knew all about it because she would tell me what had happened. And that was her way of coming back. And so I do think that we can also kind of lean into what our client,
Yeah.
sometimes people can just start talking about like a TV show or a movie, or we play music, right? I've had someone dance to, yeah. So I do think you can be very creative, but I think really the intention is when we are dissociated, we're really far. Even, I mean, right. I'm eating a bowl of cereal. I'm thinking, and someone tries to talk to me. I'm gone. It's the same concept, right? So what do? We have to come back into our surroundings. So I think whatever you can do to help someone do that is helpful.
Yeah, I'm thinking of some clients that when they dissociate, they also kind of freeze, and so like they like struggling even just to move their eyeballs to look around,
Yes.
and I mean that's usually what I start with, like just move your eyeballs, or I'll say, can you feel your shoes on your feet? So they don't even have to move,
Yep.
and like I'll look at what they are staring at. So like usually they're staring at the rug on my floor, and I'm like, okay, do you see the colors on the rug?
Yes.
What's the pictures on the rug?
Yes.
Like start kind of right where they're at, and then I can go just a little bit farther away from the current gaze, like not like just a little bit, and do it really slowly. I forget who suggested it in one of the trainings I've watched, but trying to do big movements can be a little too scary, but maybe just tapping one finger slowly. Like very, like sometimes it has to be small. It can't be this big thing. Like you have to work your way up to maybe tossing the ball back and forth.
Exactly.
And I think it's important for, therapists to know that if your client gets that stuck, like to remain calm and to know that like they won't be stuck forever, or maybe they just need to sit with it for a minute. Sometimes I just sit and wait a few
Breathe.
minutes.
Can you notice breathing?
Notice your breathing, I think those are really important pieces.
And I was that person who was trying not to freak out because I had that happen early enough in my educational, what do you want to call it, journey, that I didn't know I was like, oh, and exactly. Don't freak out. Just, okay. Yep. You're gonna be fine.
like they will come back. You don't have
they
to be
will
worried.
Come back. Yeah.
I know that's a common fear, and I'm thinking of another client, very first intake, went into a full-blown panic attack, at the very beginning. Like, that's how we started. And it was like, glad I know what to do. Like, I remember just having this moment, like, I'm going to take a big breath, but it's going to be okay,
Yeah. And I think you can learn from some of that. Like, okay, let's see if we can not get you that far. Like, we clearly went too far because now you're all the way down in hypoarousal. You are in freeze, like literally in freeze. So, okay, that was too much. We need to kind of back up and see if we can figure out, how because it's telling us something. It's not like bad. It's just telling us something. It's telling us something about your nervous system, really. A lot of this is about the nervous system. And that's the other piece that I try to teach people is like, let's talk about your nervous system and why it does what it does. Again, it's also trying to keep you alive. All of this is just trying to keep you alive. Your parts, your dissociation, your nervous system. So let's work with it, right?
That's good stuff. Yeah.
Hi, dear friends.
We hope you're enjoying the episode so far. We'd love to invite you to join Hearts Multiplied, our private online community for people living with a dissociative disorder, along with separate spaces for clinicians and supporters.
Inside Hearts Multiplied, we host live events just for you, including social hangouts, little story time, teen D&D campaigns, online gaming like Minecraft and Mario Kart, and vibrant message boards on topics like intimacy and OEA.
We also offer a supporters group and a clinical consultation group for therapists working with dissociative clients.
We Garden System facilitate 8-week peer coaching groups where we work together on internal communication and personalized healing goals.
To learn more and sign up, visit acoupleofmultiples.com. We'd love to have you.
All right. How can a therapist help a client understand their dissociation or dissociative experiences?
I think some of the stuff we're talking about, like the education, I think the more we can educate them and explain all of this to them on like a very like non-shaming level, like this idea of it's being discernment, right? And so I think education helps. I think asking them in the moment, hey, are you with me? People start to pay attention. And I think then the hope is they'll start to notice it outside. Meanwhile, you're helping them build some self-regulation skills. So that's the other thing, is if we can help expand the window of tolerance, that I think can help the central nervous system. So then maybe parts will not feel that like panic because there's a bigger window of tolerance. It takes more to get you panicked, right? So there's just a lot that happens, and I think it kind of evolves. Yeah.
And things like teaching them the back of the head scale at the beginning.
I think so. Yeah.
That's cool.
All right. So what are some things to avoid when helping a dissociated client become more present? We've heard some horror stories, man.
Had some horror stories.
Yeah.
I bet. I don't think you throw a tissue box.
No.
That's one thing. I don't think you touch them.
No.
You don't. You keep your distance. I don't think anything loud or jarring is going to be terribly helpful. I think patience, a calm voice, right? They are in a protective mode. So what can we do to help? Again, it's a safety. There's a threat. There's a sense of unsafety within the system. What can we do to slowly help them realize that it's safer, it's okay? And if we do anything too dramatic or rush or freak out, it's not going to make them feel safe.
No, it's not going to be helpful.
Right?
Yeah. And I think it's really important. Like you're not trying to snap them out of it. Or, it has to be brought gradually out of it.
Right. You literally don't snap your fingers in their face or clap.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, no.
Or blow a foghorn. That's a true story.
No. Oh my gosh.
That's awful.
Yeah. And I think I'm probably not as proactive as I can be, but like smell is a great thing. So if we have the cotton balls with essential oils on them, and during COVID, I had people have a little basket next to them so that they could have a toolkit. If they started to dissociate, they had like things they could touch. I have people who they have their things, they have their smells, and so if we're proactive about it, I think then we also can kind of help have everything right there for the person. Like, hey, that rock you really like, it's in your hand. Can you notice it? Right? Exactly. Let's give it to them ahead of time.
Like I keep right next to the couch, I have scented Play-Doh, so like it's a smelly scent Play-Doh.
That's fun.
And then I always have my essential oils like diffuser thing. I always have that going. So like I always make sure that there are smells in the room that I can refer to. So like I already have everything set up and ready. I keep a fountain in my room because you can usually hear the water trickling. Wonderful. And that's a soft sound. Yeah. So those are really great ideas, I think, to help, create the environment where there's enough sensory experiences for the person to tune into when they're in the office.
Well, again, if you know that dissociation happens, then you're prepared for it. And you can be proactive. If you're not going to be around, right? Next thing you know, you're throwing a tissue box at your person's head or blowing a foghorn.
Right. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Okay.
All right. How can a therapist normalize dissociative experiences?
We kind of talked about this.
I was going to say, yeah.
I don't know. I'm aware of time. And so I don't want to but I do have a way of explaining dissociation to clients that I'm happy to share.
Yes, please do. Yes.
So this is it's worked so far over all these years. But what I'll say is, let's imagine you were a knight in the Middle Ages and you were like the queen's best knight. So if you were going to go out there and battle, you wanted the best armor. So hopefully it was thin and it was really good iron, but it wasn't too heavy. And you had chainmail underneath, right? And you were protecting yourself from lances, maces, arrows, swords. And that was your amazing armor to fight the queen's fight, right? So now imagine you time travel to 2025 and you've got your armor with you and you're like, look at me, I'm safe as all can be in 2025. Well, what's the problem with that? And then we start talking about the problem with that, right? One of the problems is that no one's coming at you with mace. I mean, you don't actually need it walking down the street.
Don't typically need a sword fight,
No, there's no one coming at you with any of that. So it's not really necessary. Again, that discernment issue. I don't need to wear my armor in Fort Collins, Colorado. Second thing is, I'm not sure that what could hurt us today would protect us from like a car hitting me. I would rather not be wearing armor. I don't know. Something about the armor scares me, right? So it may not be what can protect you the best from what harms us today, And then the third thing, it's really, really clunky and inefficient. Like you can't drive a car in armor. It makes it hard to go grocery shopping, right? So is armor bad? Absolutely not. right? Go talk to all the knights in the Middle Ages. It's just that maybe we don't need it today. And so that seems to have been a metaphor that people have been okay with.
I love that.
I mean, we could use a coat in Antarctica, like, you have your best parka and then you come to Fort Collins, you don't need it anymore. But it's the same kind of concept. There's nothing wrong with any of it.
Right. Yeah. It's just,
maybe we don't need it anymore, or don't need to use it the same way anymore.
Right. Yeah. Knowing what you need and what you don't need anymore. I love that.
Yeah.
All right. So, what causes a person to develop a dissociative disorder? And can different selves grow and change through therapy and experiences?
Okay. So, my answer to this is I think people think about dissociative disorders and they think about the worst, awfulest, horrific trauma ever in the world. And I think that, yes, that will definitely cause somebody to develop a dissociative disorder. But I think what people miss, and one of the things I also am hoping that people can start to understand, is to like broaden the view of what trauma is. And I love the fact that ACEs came out, adverse childhood experiences. I've counted 7 out of 10 of the ACEs. So those who know the ACEs study, I don't, hopefully,
I can
I'm not going
include
to
a link in the show
explain it.
notes for
Include a
people
link
who need
to the
it.
show notes. But 7 out of 10 don't actually meet the criteria for criteria A for PTSD, because it's things like not having enough, or not having been told you were loved and not appreciated as a child. It's on the adverse childhood experiences list. And so I think what we have to appreciate is that it's not the worst things that could possibly happen to you in terms of how we think of trauma, right? We think of war, we think of death, we think of those. But being hungry, having to go into a cafeteria where food's going to get thrown on you, not being loved or appreciated by your parents. Think about being a baby with a wet diaper and no one's coming. What the heck do you do, right? You have to find a way to check out. And so I really think it's important that we look at it much more broadly and realize that trauma experiences for a child are that it's more broad, and it's not just what people think, because there's also a lot of shame from the people who don't have the worst and the worst traumas because they're struggling and they minimize and think, why do I have these symptoms when I didn't have X, Y, and Z? It's like, well, you don't need X, Y, and Z.
Right. It's not a requirement.
Yeah. And if you're, again, 9 years old and you don't think your parent loves you and you think you're going to get abandoned, you're going to die. Like, you just, again, it's terror, whether you're conscious of it or not. And what do? You find a way to dissociate from that. So, I think it really it develops out of fight, flight, freeze, and it's the freeze response. So,
okay. And so, like, getting into the second part of the question, like, when you develop like dissociative identity disorder, so like when you have all these different selves at all these different ages, like, can those different selves grow and change through therapy and various corrective reparative experiences?
I absolutely believe so. And I think one of the big things we can do when the time is right is to see if we can help orient those parts, basically retrieve them from the past so they don't have to be stuck there anymore.
Yeah.
And that can be so, I see us even just taking one part and retrieving it and orienting it to time and place, finding it a safe space, connecting with the adult, all of those things that we can do. Someone's system will just calm. It's quite apparent, like, it's dramatic. And so absolutely. I think if we couldn't do that, and again, it's the other piece, it's not about getting rid of parts ever, or even like integration, in my opinion. It's just about working together.
Right.
Yes.
And coming together and seeing each self as a team member.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This has definitely been my experience.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. How could clinicians distinguish which dissociative disorder a client may be experiencing?
You mean in terms of the diagnosis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know you spoke a little bit on this at the beginning,
I
right?
did. So I'm a social worker, and I sometimes, like, again, to me, does someone have UD? What is it? I mean, it's
OSD.
I think I call it UDD, UCC. I don't know. I'm calling it DIDNOS. I'm just going to be old.
Okay.
Do they have that, or do they have DID? I guess, like, I'm going to treat them very similar because I still have to retrieve the parts. I still have to stabilize them. It might take longer, and it might take a lot more time and, like, the interventions might be more complex, and it might take longer to get parts on board because they've been so isolated for so long. But for me, I don't know that it always matters. Like people get really hung up on the diagnosis, and I'm just more like, are you present? And like, let me get to know your system so I know how to work with it. So
Yeah, kind of what comes up, like what I've noticed is that some people get an OSDD diagnosis or the DDNOS, right? And they feel like they don't belong in the DID community sometimes, but absolutely they do, you know?
yeah.
And I know that like sometimes people get the OSDD diagnosis and then like the real work of like really getting to know your system sometimes doesn't happen, at least not therapy.
Right. I think we need to remember the continuum. It's a continuum. And
Right.
yeah, it's not a box.
Yeah, it's not yes, no. It's yeah. So and again, I think a lot of clinicians, I mean, if you think about some of the tests like the SCID D or whatever, it takes 2.5 hours. I've never used anything like that. It's just not my orientation. And I usually can figure it out with the client without having to put them through a 2.5 hour test like that, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
All right. So what can happen if a client has a dissociative system and the therapist is unaware and tries to process trauma?
So my experience, personally, is the best case scenario is that the person just dissociates and nothing happens, right? It just doesn't work. They're like their guards or their protectors are so good at protecting, they just clamp right down and they're okay because it's working so well. I think in that case, another danger is we lose somebody, right? You don't come back. Like why would you come back, right? But I think worst case scenario, and I did have this experience, and again, this part of why I think I talk about this is I did not know what I was doing, and I had some things happen that were scary, and I'm so lucky that they weren't worse than they were. But I did have someone that we had diagnosed her with DID. She knew. I mean, she's the one who came in. She knew, and we had not even planned for the deep trauma work. We were just talking kind of about doing it, and her part crashed her car. So basically she dissociated, and she knew that this part had taken over. And the part basically said, I was trying to, she was like, why couldn't you get my attention some other way? And it was like, I tried. And so I know that sounds so dramatic, but that was her experience. And we were able to work with this part and make a deal of how to move forward. It needed to be included, and it wasn't. It was just being shut out. So can you imagine having a job for 30 years and then someone comes in and just takes over and is just like, ignoring everything you've set up for the past 30 years? Well, I can't imagine it actually. It's kind of happening.
Yeah.
God. Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, so they get mad. Or sometimes people have persecutor parts, right? So the perpetrators are really good at manipulation, and a part can kind of get created to sort of take that role. And so you really need to be careful. And so that's where it's like you need to get to know the system. So
right. And I think that's important there because like what the part said was that, or what that self said was that I tried to get your attention.
Yes.
Right. And like, so we have to, and I can get on a whole soapbox about this, but I think it's so important to really understand the system of selves before doing the trauma processing and bringing those selves in to give permission.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of times, what I hear about is a lot of people with AD, like the therapists are not helping them get to know all their selves. And I think that's crucial.
Yeah. And it's really, at the end of every session, just to say, does any part or self have anything to say? And if they do, even if you don't have time, say, I'm so glad you spoke up. Is it okay if we start with this next week? I really want to hear from you. But I tell my clients, and I tell them to tell their parts, that it is not a democracy when we're doing trauma work. I call it a unanimity, which is not a word, but everyone has to be on board. Everybody. And so if any part is saying, I'm not, I don't know, then we work with it, and everybody has to be on board.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And like, I also will say, like, if you don't want to be here for the work, that's okay. You don't have to be here till you're ready, but if you're willing to let the others, great. And then where will you go?
And you can create working teams, and you can send parts that don't want to be part of it to, you can get so creative if I've had glass barriers where they're watching, but they can't hear anything. People go to safe states, but you can, or safe places, but you can create a team to do the work. Yes.
Yeah.
It can be very intentional. But again, you're working with the client and themselves, right? How are we going to do this?
Exactly. Inclusive, And some of our next questions are going to talk a little bit about EMDR, and we will have another episode that will focus solely on EMDR. But I think this also needs to be said before we dive into this, because there's a huge myth going around, and I saw it today in the same group where I found you, where somebody was asking about doing EMDR with a DID client, and the very first comment was, "You don't do EMDR with DID clients."
So can I tell you the biggest reason why that's wrong is in 2010, Francine Shapiro came out and said EMDR is a therapy. It's got 8 phases and it's got 3 prongs. So I tell people, it's not that you have an EMDR client. You're an EMDR therapist. Everyone's an EMDR client, but it might take us 2 years to get into the trauma work. But you're still in phases 1 and 2. You're still thinking from the AIP model. You're still appreciating the client of how their system works. You're looking for adaptive memory networks. You're identifying maladaptive memory networks. You're doing all of the same things while you're working with the selves to prepare this. It's phase 2. It's a very, very, very long phase 2, but it's still EMDR therapy because the bottom line is it's a storage issue.
Thank you.
Where the memories are stored. So that's my biggest reason I think that everybody's an EMDR client.
Love it. Love that explanation. Yes. Okay. I'm happy now.
How do you determine when a client is ready to use EMDR to process their traumas?
So we talked a little bit about this, right? So every part has to be on board. And you can set up working teams. You can do a lot of prep work like that. But some of the stuff I look for is, can they hold dual awareness? So how are they doing because I've had people reprocessing in phase 4 with EMDR and they'll say, oh, I think I'm dissociating. Oh, fantastic. You caught that. Great. Let's get you back. What do you need? And you can modify, but that person, we had done enough preparation work that she was able to take a time out, we regroup, move forward. So they have to be able to hold dual awareness, or at the very least catch when they're not in dual awareness. They have to be able to self-regulate. And that means in and out of your office. They have to be able to be able to get back into what we call the window of tolerance. They have to have access to their negative memories, right? And if they don't, guess what? You should not be touching, a past anything with EMDR therapy. There have to be adaptive memory networks. And I think that makes it a little harder sometimes to assess, right? But there has to be something that can be connected to. And then finally, they have to be able to tolerate affect without going kind of like, off into the netherland or down into dissociation. So those are 5 things that a therapist named Dini Laliotis shared at a training once. And I've held on to those as like a shorthand. And I think they cover they really are very like a blanket assessment that you can make. And that becomes your treatment plan, right? You're not holding dual awareness. So that's sort of the overview. But I think the other pieces of it, you have to get everybody on board. You sometimes have to do little tests. You don't jump into the worst trauma with the worst, but there are so many ways to titrate, to kind of test the system, to modify EMDR, that I do think that you can have a lot of success. And I think you can have a lot of really robust trait change, maybe not full trauma recovery, but you can do a lot in phase 2.
Yeah, I think there is a lot, So like for some people out there, because like our listeners are people with lived experience as well as clinicians, and not everyone really understands like what are the phases of EMDR. So if you could just quickly do like a brief overview of what phases 1 and 2 are of EMDR, and then like what are the do's and don'ts during these phases for clients with DID?
Okay, we got another soapbox coming.
Yep.
So the way EMDR is taught, and again, it's a brilliant model. I've been doing it for 20 some odd years, and it's my model. But phase 1 is assessment and history taking. Phase 2 is stabilization and safety. And so the way a lot of folks are taught is that in that phase 1, that's when you start creating your EMDR treatment plan, your kind of AIP informed treatment plan, where you start figuring out what your targets are going to be. And a lot of people are teaching that you don't really go 1 and 2 in order. You kind of have to weave them together. But a lot of folks are very, they're very like 1, 2, whatever. So my belief is in those early phases, phase 1 really needs to be assessment of how stable are you? Do you have a dissociative disorder? How are you functioning, right? And I will oftentimes move into phase 2, even the first session. They come in, clients come in, even if they don't have a dissociative disorder, they're anxious as heck. They come in and you're like, tell me your story. Bye. And I'm like, why would you ever want to come back? Right? No,
Right.
tell me, you seem really anxious. Would you like to spread your intake time, me getting to know you over time? And I can spend half our session teaching you a skill today. Why would you not do that? I mean, why,
Exactly.
well, I know why, because certain, powers that be make us do an intake first. But so I really think phase 1 needs to be assess stability, assess dissociation, assess functioning, all of that. And then you might weave in, and you probably should weave in phase 2, which is preparation and safety.
Yeah.
And that you can get all the other stuff later when the person's more stable.
Yeah. Like, so I did my training with Dr. Jamie Marich, my basic
Mm-hmm.
EMDR training, and she basically goes, you do phase 2 first, then you do phase 1. Like, she kind of flips those 2 phases around, which I do think is really helpful to get all the skills in before we start talking about traumas and target memories and all of those other
Yes.
things.
But people get confused and they think EMDR really is like a trauma therapy, but really what it is it looks at your symptoms and then goes backwards. And so this focus on trauma timeline, that's what you don't do. You don't do a trauma timeline. You definitely don't send someone home to do a trauma timeline. I don't need to know actually what happened to you. I can tell that you're having a hard time. Let's get you stable. Let's teach you some skills. So I have huge issues with that. And I really try to encourage people to, and I break it down as 1A is how do you function? How stable are you? What are your coping skills? And do you dissociate? Phase 2 becomes the next step. And then phase 1B is, okay, you're ready to do phase 3. Let's get into it. But that's how I see it. So I agree with Jamie. Yes.
Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this one's really important. What are some ways the therapist can redirect the client if they are giving so many trauma details that they're potentially re-traumatizing themselves?
Yes, I'm so glad you're asking this. So a lot of people will say, oh, I have to be like client-centered is letting the client come in and hemorrhage their history. That's not client-centered. I think client-centered is helping them understand what the risks and benefits are. And then they decide for sure. I'm not going to disempower you, but I don't think people know how to do therapy, especially if they've been in talk therapy for years, and they'll come in and talk as long as you let them. And so I do think we have to have like an educational approach. And so I learned this from Joanne Twombly. I don't like taking credit for things that I didn't come up with. And I still like people's best ideas. I think that's
what we do, right?
That's my superpower is I still, but I'll say something like, oh my gosh, I have a dilemma. Part of me, and again, modeling the language too, part of me thinks you probably have no one to talk to and that you might need to tell your story. And there's a part of me that wants to make the space for that for you. But there's another part of me that knows that sometimes opening the door to trauma memories, it's really hard to close. I also know that I don't need this information right now. And there's a part of me that wants to kind of slow you down a little to make sure that anything you're telling me that you'll be able to contain when you leave. That's my dilemma. What should we do about it? Right. And so now we're having a conversation. And I did read something recently where Dolores Mascara works with her clients to say, how are you going to know when you've shared too much and it's not working? How are you going to know what your limit is? And that I love more than anything, because now the client gets to start assessing how they're doing, right? Rather than my saying, nope, you can't talk about your trauma.
Right.
Never going to do that.
Be aware. Yeah.
Yes. And it builds that awareness. And so, and also just, you may have think you're supposed to tell me everything, but I actually don't need to know right now. And it's kind of like opening a closet and all the stuff spills out and then you can't get it back in.
Right.
And I want to make sure your closet's nice and locked before. So let's be clear about what this can look like. And so, and then I end up doing more structure in my therapy with people because I think they need some. Not again, I have had consultees say to me, you don't talk to your clients. And I do talk to my clients. I do let them talk. But I also think there has to be a good balance in there, or else they're just going to be doing the same thing over and over again that they've done. And that doesn't heal trauma.
Right.
Right?
I do think there is some talking that sometimes will need to happen between sets and things, and that is okay too.
Absolutely. But again, if I can educate them as to the caution, then let them decide. I feel like that's to me informed consent.
Yeah.
Right.
I love that.
All right. Thank you. All right. So our next question we've already technically covered. So what I'm going to do is put some links in the show notes that kind of reference because the question is, what assessments for dissociative disorders do you recommend? And we've already talked about the DES and the MID, and we did mention the SCID-D or whatever. So I'll put some information in there about those, but you kind of already went over that. So
I think I did.
Yeah. Perfect.
I know what this one, Garden System has an opinion on this, but
I do, but we're gonna let you talk first.
Can you discuss your thoughts on the idea of working through the adult self when doing EMDR with a client that has dissociative identity disorder?
So you're saying specifically with doing EMDR. So I don't know if anyone can tell, but like my bent is IFS. I'm not a formally trained IFS therapist, but I am IFS informed. So I tend to like the idea of self. And I especially like the idea of self for me, because I find that if I'm in self, I'm a much more effective therapist. So I do think overall there's merit in being able to have the client talk to parts, so that that's just a good, like someone has to kind of be the project manager in some ways. In terms of doing EMDR, I think you can play around a little bit with it. So like, I think you can have parts be present. I think you can have parts doing the processing. Like, I do think you actually have some room to be creative, but probably the word intentional is going to be the big word that I'm going to say. I think anything we do really needs like an intentionality about it. And most likely it needs collaboration with our client. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of this needs collaboration with our client.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that, because everyone, like every system, every client with AD is going to be a little unique and a little different, even though there's like those commonalities, and there's a large portion of us out there that don't necessarily identify with the idea of self or the idea of a core self or even having a host, and that's definitely our system, like that's kind of why we keep going by Garden System, because like it just includes everybody that way in that sense, and I see a lot of it in trainings where there's a huge emphasis, almost like forcing clients to work through an adult self, and like that would used to get on our nerves. They'd be like, so where's Tiffany? And I'm like, there is no Tiffany. So what are you going to do about that now? Like that little attitude going with it. Right. And there are some of our cells, or particularly our littles, that again, like you're talking about, those protective parts that are holding those trauma memories, and they don't want, like they're not supposed to be shown to anybody else, and so Jenny's our 4-year-old self, and she's like, I'll do the EMDR as long as nobody else is here, like nobody else can be here, kind of thing. And I know that, I think this is important to know, that like it's okay if that's how the client shows up, if that's what is wanted, And so one of the things that I have incorporated because of my own personal experience, is talking to clients like, okay, who needs to be here? Like, whose memory is it? Who does it belong to? Who do they want here with them? And then is there anybody that they don't want here that we need to have go someplace else? So those are my 3 main questions that I kind of set up. And I actually will have clients use the whiteboard and literally draw it out, like who's here and like where everybody else is. And sometimes we'll even set up, like, can somebody like raise the flag if the part that's not supposed to be here does pop in, like, can we have the pause to let us know something's, not right, we need to do something. And I think that's really key too, is to remember, that there's a lot of pieces moving, and having somebody that can step in and alert the therapist and make you aware, because like Jenny might be processing but not realizing that some parts are peeking in because some of our bigs are a little nosy, what's that trauma you got there that you won't tell us about, and she's like, no, you can't be here,
but you can see as you're talking though, the key piece I think is that everybody's involved, right?
Yes.
And so that to me becomes really important.
Right.
Yeah. And that there's choice within the system. I think one of the sentences I love the most, that I use a lot and I teach people a lot. So if I was working with someone and I'm like, where's Tiffany? And they're like, well, Tiffany, I would say, you know what? I bet there's a really good reason why you don't want Tiffany here. Can you tell me what that is? And let's figure out, what does she need to be here? What's the benefit? What's the harm? Like, let's talk about this practically. If we don't include Tiffany, Is that going to make things better or worse for our goals? What are our goals? And so, I mean, really, I think you just keep collaborating.
Yeah, and I think that's good, but I do want to clarify,
Yeah.
the reason we say that is because nobody identifies as Tiffany. That's just
Oh,
the name
right.
on our driver's license, right?
True.
Yeah.
True. Yeah. That's a good, sorry. That's
so I think it's just important to recognize that sometimes people just assumed that Tiffany should show up. But it was more no, if you want somebody that can sign that informed consent and knows what it means, you want Leanna. That's what you want.
And that's a good reminder. I appreciate you correcting me. Yeah, that was a really
well.
good
I think it's just a good point because it gives us more information. Just just trying to say why not Tiffany gives you information because she gave you an answer, you know, and then why doesn't Jenny want so and so there? Why is that important?
Right. Those are all great questions to ask.
It leads to more information, which is good information.
Yeah, so I think that's great to ask those questions. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing all that. Okay. Oh, it's my question now. Okay, here we go. And I actually
Here's another soapbox.
I kind of really talked about some of this already. Let's see here. So we strongly believe in doing some system management work, which many therapists may refer to as parts work, before implementing EMDR. I really consider it to be kind of I can't say this word, an integral part of phase 2 resourcing work. So we believe that clients should have a good handle on who is who in their system with a plethora of resourcing skills, as each self may need their own coping skills compared to other selves. And we also focus on mapping out relationships of internal trust as well as the internal world. And so some questions, like I said, we focus on who needs to be here, who else does that self want here, who needs to tuck away inside the internal world, who can keep an eye on those tucked away and make us aware if those selves come back out. What are some other additional considerations that therapists should keep in mind or implement to help prepare clients with DID for EMDR trauma reprocessing?
I think what everything you said is fantastic. I think for me, some of it is the mechanics. So shorter sets. I think it's important to have a dialogue with your clients about eye movements or tappers. Eye movements more intense, maybe tappers or tapping is better. Eyes open, eyes closed. Eyes open can help with presence. I will be more involved. I will say yep, it's old stuff. I'm right here with you. I will to help with the dual awareness. Checking, just okay, let's check in. Where are you? Just for the heck of it, where are you? And if they're ooh, I'm starting to, then okay, let's take a pause. No problem. Let's see, and then we decide what to do next, right? And I have clients who'll say, I'm done for today. And you know what? The minute they say they're done, they're done.
Yeah.
I don't push, I don't argue, because I need their dissociative part to understand that there are other choices now, right? You don't have to dissociate because I'm going to listen to you. We're done.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And then again, I really am big on the all parts on board. It's a unanimity.
Yes.
Yeah. And if they change their mind, right, then how can you tell me? If you're getting, or can you tell somebody, right? If you're getting that kind of communication, and it's empowering, and it's very different from what most of, the early life was like.
Yeah.
Where no one listened and no one, So
yeah. I also use some distancing techniques as well. Really focus on reminding clients to, you have one foot here with me, that dual awareness that you've been talking about, but kind of reassuring clients, I'm right here with you. You're kind of encouragement too, you're capable, and we're going to pause when we need to. And, sometimes we just pause and do a grounding exercise and then try to go back to it, and asking what do you need to feel safer to do this? I don't want my therapist across the room on the chair. You're gonna sit right next to me, right here, because then I know that helps keep me in the room. And I think
I've
that's
offered
okay.
people, if I'm right close to them doing eye movements, I'll offer you, if you need to squeeze my hand, it's here for you.
Yes.
You don't have to, right? Or do you want to hold a rock? Or do you want to hold,
Yes.
What do you need to,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep.
And really the theme, I think a lot of what we're talking about is you just have to keep asking. We just have to stay curious. And I think if we collaborate, I collaborate all over the place in all of my EMDR work with everybody.
Yeah.
because I don't have the answers. And that's why I love EMDR. I don't have to have the answers. It's the person's brain healing.
Absolutely.
It's
And then
amazing.
thinking about the different ways to do the bilateral stimulation, right? So you have the eye
Mhm.
movements, I'll here for the camera, eye movements, right? Or the light bar, or, holding the tappers, which we will never do.
Mhm.
And then having, or just tapping, those are
Headphones.
things, and
Headphones.
then and sometimes different cells will want different bilateral stimulation
That's
methods.
true.
We have ones that want the light bar, and then they have like their own color for the light bar. Then we have those that, Daisy, our 3-year-old, would do. She would take a pen and draw lines on a paper back and forth to get the eye movements,
Perfect.
and then Jenny would use the sand tray and she would draw lines in the sand to do hers, and like you can get creative even with that as well. And that different selves might want different ways of doing it.
But one of the things that's striking me as you're talking is how much time and effort and just time it took to get to the point where all of these decisions could get made so that EMDR reprocessing can happen. And I think it just reinforces slow is fast. We do not have to be in a race to phase 4. And people do not understand, again, that EMDR is 8 phases.
Right.
And that spending all that time in phase 2, my hunches, was incredibly healing for you as you went. And it wasn't like, oh, we didn't heal till phase 4. No, you heal all along, but it takes time.
It does.
Yeah.
There's a lot of healing work that takes place before you even touch the trauma.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. All right.
All right. What workshops, trainings, or consultations do you offer, and how can people contact you?
Well, and I appreciate everyone's time because we talked a lot. I loved being here, by the way. This was just delightful hearing your stories. You're doing such an important thing
Thank you.
by
Thank you
being
for
so
being
open
here.
and sharing. And just, again, if we can just normalize this. But in terms of what I offer, I do quite a few consultation groups. Actually, I think I'm up to like 15 a month, possibly. And so some of it is for community mental health in my area. Some of it is for people who are right out of basic training. I can do that only for a couple of organizations. I do certification groups. I do advanced groups for people where we can just talk about all this stuff and they can learn how to work with complex cases and pull in other modalities. And I do also have a number of on-demand classes and live classes that I teach that all have EMDRIA credits with them. And so all of that's available on my website, which is advanced-emdr-education.com. And the hyphens make it look nice, but they're really obnoxious. So advanced-emdr-education.com. I'm working right now. I'm teaching I've taught it twice this spring, a live class on just the first 2 phases of EMDR working with dissociation. And it's basically phases 1 and 2. It's 12 hours. And so that is, I'm working really hard to get that on demand. And so.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll put the website in the show notes so people you can just click on it, people. It'll be okay.
But I also, I think we all do our best to understand and to be open and like bring our best whatever to, but I also appreciate like feedback that like here's a correction or here's a clarification. So honestly, if any of your audience has something to share, I would welcome email or call or just, here's something I don't think you got right, because all of that feedback only makes me wiser in an understanding that all of the nuance of experience that people have. So
fantastic. Thank you so much. So what is one final thought you would like to leave with our listeners?
Wow. Out of all my soapboxes.
I know.
Honestly, and we talked so much about the assessment, but I really think this idea our community needs to understand to broaden the view of what trauma is. That's something I think that is just really damaging. I'm trying to write a book on this. I very slowly work on it and then I put pauses on it. But what it's like, just invalidation as a trauma as a child, what that does for you, because people will not see that as a trauma, but it's when you're treated like you're invisible, it's incredibly damaging. So I think being able to appreciate the lens of trauma and that people dissociate for all kinds of different reasons to cope. And it doesn't have to be the worst of the worst. There's just all these misconceptions around that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's really good to know, because a lot of times, like I remember a therapist, and I kind of had this idea that maybe I might have DID. And her response was, do you know what kind of trauma you would have to have?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us
Well,
today.
thank
This
you, and
was
thank you for sharing so much
fabulous.
time with me.
Yeah.
I'm very chatty,
Yeah.
but
So,
you are delightful, and I'm going to
thank
make sure to
you.
pass on your website or your
Thank you.
podcast to folks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, our hope is that more therapists will feel confident in recognizing and assessing for dissociation in their clients.
Yes.
Yes. All right.
Thank you for hanging out with
A
couple
couple
of
of
multiples.
multiples.
This episode is sponsored by the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, ICM, soon to be the Creative Mindfulness Network, is the only EMDR therapy training program founded by an openly plural clinician, EMDR therapy author, Dr. Jamie Plus Marich.
We felt so seen and validated when we were able to authentically participate in this training as Garden System. And although grounded in the EMDR International Association for Curriculum Standards, ICM elevates the values of lived experience and the expressive arts in their training programs.
They actively work with shattering the stigma around dissociative responses. Please visit www.instituteforcreativemindfulness.com to learn more. Today's episode is sponsored by Petals of a Rose, a short film about a day in the life of a woman living with dissociative identity disorder.
Petals of a Rose has received international acclaim for being an accurate and respectful depiction of DID. The most common response from DID systems being, I've never felt so seen.
The film has subtitles available in 13 languages, and audio descriptions are included for the visually impaired.
Petals of a Rose is available to watch for free at www.dylancrumpler.com/watch-petals-of-a-rose. Thank you, dear friends, for spending time with us today.
We're so grateful for each of you and all the important work you're doing. Whether it's supporting others or navigating your own healing journey, we hope this episode brought insight, encouragement, and something new to consider.
If it did, we'd love for you to share it with a friend, your therapist, psychiatrist, or colleagues. It's one more step toward changing how the world understands DID.
And just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for therapy. Listening does not create a therapeutic relationship with the hosts or any guest speakers.
Until next time, take gentle care, and thank you for hanging out with
A couple of multiples.